Hey everybody, congrats on making it through the third section of this course, and we're starting up the final and fourth section of new material. And to start this section, we're going to cover a lot of the topics that I traditionally would refer to as hot topics regarding representation, but have made the restructure towards democracy and its boundaries. And we'll understand that in detail throughout today's lecture. So today's lecture, we're going to cover three overarching concepts. Why and how do we vote the way we vote as individuals, as citizens in the United States, and when measured by political scientists, how do they summarize our voting habits? Also, the mechanism of gerrymandering, which guides us through our electoral process and oftentimes determines the extent of competitive races in the United States, and a mechanism of restricting voting access for millions of individuals currently in effect, which is felony disenfranchisement. So we're going to explore these three concepts in depth today, and let's get going. Learning objectives, well, here I just covered a lot of this. We also will touch on a concept called a demagogue, something that was briefly hinted towards in Federalist Paper number 10, but we will explore in a little bit more detail with just a quick, I think, 2 slides at the end of today's lecture. So let's start by looking at why we vote the way we do. When we record people's voting habits over the past many decades, we see consistent tendencies that tend to revolve around one of three reasons for casting a ballot for their identified party of choice, or maybe under certain circumstances, the party that does not represent their historical party of choice. So when we look at this at first, we have to understand the influence of party loyalties. 80% of individuals tend to maintain the same party identification that they establish in their youth throughout the entirety of their lives. That is 80% roughly. That is measured by recent political scientist studies exploring why we have these voting habits. We also understand that when we don't vote along party lines, we have a higher tendency to be driven by one of two factors. That is, issues involved or candidate characteristics. So let's explore issues involved first. We see that issues involved tend to either include spatial issues or valence issues. This is simply put as a valence issue is one that we all generally want a higher value of. Think of honesty of a representative, economic prosperity, and opportunity. Those are all valence issues we are all advocating for greater extents of. When we look at other options, we see spatial issues. This is where we see a lot of the debate come in when it comes to policy initiatives. Spatial issues often offer a range of possible options among a single choice. The best way to express this is minimum wage policies. In Virginia, you can make my life as a child very sad and make the minimum wage $7.25 as it was, while in Montana, you can have a minimum wage upwards of $9 to $10. This allows for each state among our United States to have a different, unique policy that is on a different point along this spectrum. So spatial issues allow a lot of variation among policy initiatives. This also includes policy initiatives revolving around women's reproductive rights in the United States, as this is now a state's issue, and we see spatial issues being represented in the wide-ranging policy initiatives going in effect in each of the many states. Montana being one, as we enacted new policy initiatives among this general overarching issue in recent elections. So we see that issues involved, we have valence and spatial issues, a key distinction to be made, but oftentimes mobilize voters. We see single issue voters is how we often refer to it, oftentimes revolving around the sentiments of the economy or any of the other issues that I previously mentioned, minimum wage being one in certain elections. Now, we also have to understand the primary candidate characteristics that tend to bring people to vote the way they do. We know that this is, well, easily understood, reflecting on the last decade or two of American politics. Sometimes candidates come in representing unique racial, ethnic, regional identifications, class, popularity, so many different social backgrounds, and even economic backgrounds that can make somebody a unique candidate under certain circumstances. We also have to understand that when we do have an election, we oftentimes see the incumbent benefit in effect. Incumbent, that is the representative who either is currently or previously held the office they are running for re-election. So think of it as, you know, in the, I'm trying to think of an ideal example, but in the last presidential election, we had Joe Biden running at the very beginning of the election for re-election. He was the incumbent. We see throughout history in American politics, incumbents have a strong benefit when it comes to their electoral advantage because of name familiarity. But we do see that this is all not absolute, and we do have many scenarios in U.S. history where the incumbent does not win the election. And when we think about representation at large, it's important to have a clear understanding of a distinction between two different approaches to representing the public's needs. We see that when you vote, you have the opportunity to advocate for either a delegate representative or a trustee representative. These are two individuals that will govern on two distinctly different metrics. When we look at a delegate representative, we see an individual who will be elected by the general public to represent the will that the general public would have likely determined if they were casting ballot referendums. So simply put, a delegate representative will do what the majority of their constituents would desire. That is the primary means in which they will determine their next action. Is it what the majority desires? In a sense, delegate representation is a majority representation. In contrast to that, trustee representations is when we elect representatives to govern in what they believe is our best interest. So we see circumstances where there may be a policy initiative that would bring greater economic prosperity to the constituents at large, but may not be advocated for by the majority of constituents. A trustee representative would advocate for the implementation of that policy initiative, although the majority of their constituents are not directly advocating for it. Trustee representative, let's simplify this, is an individual that you think can do the job well because they have experience. This is an individual with an economics background who you believe has a unique capability to govern along economic metrics. A delegate representative is one that has a unique insight into the sentiments of their constituents, into the sentiments of the population they're representing. They may not be an expert on economics, but they do know what we as a collective desire and believe, and they will represent our ethics and morality within governance, while trustees will represent our needs in governance. Both have notable value within our electoral system, and it is up to the individual to determine whether you would rather advocate for a delegate or a trustee to represent you in the legislature. Now, when we talk about representation and really the legislature at large, we remember that, for one, the House of Representatives is based off of population, and the apportionment of seats among states is based off of the population of those states. But we see that we have to constantly revise this to have it be equal between states and between districts. And as a result, we've seen many districts that are not perfectly equal to others that are comparable. For one example, we see the state of Delaware has one total House district that represents 990,000 people, nearly 1 million individuals represented by one United States House representative. In contrast, we have districts in the state of Wyoming in which we have one representative representing as few as 580,000 individuals. So when we rewind and go back to the beginning of advocacy for this apportionment within our House based on population, we see there was a proposal led by James Madison in Federalist Paper number 51. In this text, he says directly, "In general, it may be remarked on this subject that no political problem is less susceptible of a precise solution than that which relates to the number most convenient for a representative legislature. The ratio between the representatives and the people ought not to be the same where the latter are very numerous as where there are very few." In this, if you read the entirety of this text, you see his advocacy for a House of Representatives structure that has roughly 30,000 to 50,000 citizens per every single representative. We see with our extensive population booms over many decades, we are not able to effectively maintain this ratio. If we were maintaining the ratio advocated by James Madison, our United States House of Representatives would have over 6,000 members. That is not effective. We see since 1920, we capped the number of House members we will include when we look at the apportionment. Instead, we will just reshift the total number of those 435 seats between states. That's why in our last census year, the state of Montana obtained one more House representative when California lost one of theirs. Now, when we look at the districts and the relationship that they have between them, it is very important to note that when we look at the 435 House representative seats within our United States, only 69 of them are seats in which either political party has a legitimate opportunity to win the election. Those are referred to as competitive seats. 69 out of 435 seats means that we have 16% of our House of Representative seats being those where there is a truly competitive opportunity for either political party to obtain them. Now, this is something that has increased over years, and many people point to the district ratios as a means in which has resulted in this end of having a lack of competitive races. So when we look at the most elections before the year of 1970, we see roughly 30 to 40% of those races were competitive in nature. So we see a declining in competitive races. We see a ratio of representatives to constituents increasing with every decade, and in many states not being adequately representative of other states in comparison. And we remember that James Madison was originally advocating for a House of Representatives that had one representative for every 30,000 constituents. Now, when we talk about, and I briefly mentioned this, the capping the number of seats within the House of Representatives, we remember that we did, over time, continuously increase the number of seats. We would do this at census years. It was from 1790 to 1910, the number of representatives steadily grew every single census year. We had 65 House representatives in 1790, and now we have 435 today. But we remember, if we maintain the same ratio that we had when we only had 65 House representatives, we would have over 6,000 representatives at the moment. So that was ineffective. And that's what brought us to enact the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929. Although we stopped in adding new House seats in 1910, we later required the legislation of 1929 to put this in absolute effect. So we see at the time when this initiative was implemented, we had a ratio of one representative to every 280,000 citizens. This has ballooned, in some instances multiplying by 4, most by about 2 to 3. We remember that this is when we capped the number of House seats in 1929. So this cap has maintained ever since at 435, and since then we re-examine the number of House seats every single census year. So every 10 years, so 1910, 1920, 1930, 2010, 2020. That's why in 2020, California lost a House seat and Montana obtained one. That is the result of the Reapportionment Act of 1929, benefiting the state of Montana in recent years. So we see this act reads directly, the number of representatives shall hereafter be 435, beginning with the 83rd Congress, and thereafter the apportionment of representatives shall be made by the method now known as the method of equal proportions. So aiming to the best of capabilities to implement equal proportions between each House representative. This, as we see comparing the state of Delaware to the state of Wyoming, has instances where it is not absolutely effective, but we do see this reapportionment of seats due to this legislation in 1929 every census year. So that's the overarching concepts. Why do we vote the way we vote? What about our electoral system? What does our electoral system look like today? How competitive are these races, and how often do we actually have a chance to sway an election from one party to the other? Well, we know those general trends and only 16% competitive races, but we also we have to understand why and what means were utilized to result in the decreasing of competitive races. Well, one of the primary practices that resulted in the decreasing of competitive races is the practice of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, in one sentence, is the manipulation of an electoral constituency's boundaries to benefit one party, class, or demographic at large. When we look at court cases predominantly revolving around gerrymandering, we see focuses on two dimensions of gerrymandering: partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. Of course, this is partisan gerrymandering is where you are aiming to benefit a political party. Racial gerrymandering is aiming to dilute or concentrate minority voting powers to benefit opposing majority powers. This is a result of having single-member districts. Without single-member districts dividing the state into multiple districts with a single individual representing the many constituents, we would not have the ability and opportunity for gerrymandering practices in the United States. So we also know when we look at the opportunity to redraw district maps, Traditionally, this is a practice that was granted to majority parties or nonpartisan committees that are able to determine this following every census year. So once we get the new data on how many seats, House seats the state of Montana will have in 2020, the state legislature will, or, depending on the state, it varies within each state, but most states will have the state legislature then draw the new district maps. We have seen in recent years in the state of Texas and responsive in the state of California, political initiatives to redraw district maps outside of census years. That is something that has been under national attention and national scrutiny in the last, about year and a half. So in your own individual lives, try your best to engage in that topic through a bipartisan perspective, acknowledging the practices of both political parties. But when we look at gerrymandering, it's best to understand this by zooming out and looking at our history of gerrymandering practices. So, before we dive into some court cases and the legitimacy of gerrymandering, it's also very important to understand that we have a natural tendency to gerrymander ourselves. This is not just elected individuals sitting behind a desk, the suits redrawing our district maps. It is our natural tendencies. As you can see in the picture to the right, this very red picture. One would likely assume, well, I would like to ask, if we were in an in-person class, I would have you raise your hands and somebody tell me what percentage of this map, when you look at individuals, is red compared to the percentage of this map when you look at individuals that is blue. You may think, well, this is obviously mostly red, mostly Republican. Well, you are actually seeing a circumstance in which this is a near 50-50 split. But due to the concentration of Democrats in urban cities and the distribution of Republicans in rural areas, we see a map that looks like this. And that is because of our natural tendency to gerrymander. As we see Pew Research and other Gallup polls have measured the extent to which Democrats, when they move, prioritize sentiments revolving around cultural diversity, revolving around things like having multiple different types of food available within a walking distance. While you see Republican and Republican voters have a higher tendency to prefer rural settings when buying and moving into new homes that have more security and have more space and land and protection. So we see those tendencies among individuals and among these partisan groups to result in our natural gerrymandering. If you were interested in looking into this topic in more detail, there is a great work by Catherine Kramer examining the state of Wisconsin and the tendency for us to naturally gerrymander within that state. She identifies a stronger correlation between rural and urban identities than there even are between partisan identities. And she even makes many claims in this work that we see more division led by this urban-rural divide than we see, at least in states like Wisconsin, than we see led by the Democrat-Republican divide, which many people gravitate towards when measuring political polarization. So when we look at gerrymandering, how do they do this? Well, there are really two main practices. And we also understand another practice of hijacking kidnapping that relates to gerrymandering as well. But we're going to look at this image, this part to the left where it says competitive. That is an optimally drawn district. Simple, geographically based, 4 districts in 1 square area. Well, we're going to divide it into 4s with no consideration of the distribution of demographics within those districts. And we see in all 4 of these districts a competitive opportunity for either party to win the election. That is a result having 4 competitive elections. Now, if we look at the practice of packing, one can take one political party and purposely draw a district that has almost every single representative of that political party in it and almost exclusively members of that political party, basically saying we will give this political party 1 race guaranteed. But as a result of them having this one office in which they can guarantee a win, we will have a near guarantee in the 3 other districts that we are drawing up. So this is a result that although we're benefiting one party by giving them a guaranteed race, we're harming them in the long run by guaranteeing that the opposing party, in this instance blue, has 3 races compared to 1. So that is the practice of packing. You concentrate voters of one's opposition into a single district or a few districts to minimize their influence in other districts. Now when we look at the other means of cracking, this is where you divide voters of the opposition across multiple districts with the purpose of diluting their influence. So you can say, well, we're going to maintain that this district is 30% Democratic, and then this district also 30% Democratic. So they will have a hard chance to win those elections if, and we will give one election to them as well using packing practices. So this is a means in which you can distribute a vote among a couple districts to maintain a near guarantee that their influence is highly diminished. In cracking and packing is where you can guarantee them one race while diluting their influence in all of the races. Now, when we look at these practices, we also have to understand the party tendencies of hijacking and kidnapping, where this is within political primaries predominantly, in which a party may oust, in their sense, attempt to oust a party member by making a competitive race within a primary when what was referred to previously as a safe seat. So you may see this being a downstream impact of internal party conflicts at certain times. But we do primarily revolve towards understanding the means of gerrymandering being packing and cracking. And here's a visualization of some of our most gerrymandered districts. I always like to point out when you look at Maryland's 3rd district, this thin line here towards the top, that is a region, because all districts have to be geographically connected. That is a region that connects 2 neighborhoods via a simple highway in which there is no population living there, which brings in a lot of questions of how and why can we enable gerrymandering practices that draw districts that include strips of highways connecting 2 geographically divided areas. So we see this practice utilized heavily in Maryland's 3rd district and additionally in Illinois' 4th district. But these are not the only districts that are a downstream impact of gerrymandering, and we see this trend occurring throughout U.S. history. So, gerrymandering, to wrap that up, we have to understand that gerrymandering is present in the United States, and one of the primary means to addressing this conflict is by nonpartisan committees and collectives that are tasked with not allowing certain metrics to be considered when determining these practices, when determining the district maps. So we have seen numerous court cases addressing the role of racial and partisan gerrymandering, and we have currently a notable degree of laws that restrict these practices. We also know one of the primary dimensions of our democracy's boundaries includes those limited circumstances when we restrict one's right to vote, which does exist in the United States. That brings us to felony disenfranchisement. This is when one loses the right to vote after being convicted of a felony. This currently exists in numerous states, and we'll go through that list in just a moment, but we know as a result of this, in the states that it is in effect, roughly 4 million Americans currently lack voting access due to disenfranchisement laws. 5.9 million disenfranchised individuals at the peak of 2016, but like our prison populations, we do see a gradual decline in recent years after public advocacy for dismantling of felony disenfranchisement legislation. We see 1.7% of the voting population was disenfranchised in the year of 2024. As we know, when we look at presidential elections, 1.7% can be a game-changing percentage of the general public. Now, we understand that implementation of felony disenfranchisement began alongside black codes during the Reconstruction era and picked up significantly alongside Jim Crow legislation during the Civil Rights era. We see when we look at states with the most adamant and hard-lined felony disenfranchisement laws, we see in 2 states, Florida predominantly and Tennessee, more than 6% of the adult population, 1 of every 17 adults, is currently disenfranchised. In November 2018, Florida voters did pass Amendment 4 to the Constitution of Florida by ballot initiative. This allowed most people who have completed their sentence to vote, with the exception of people convicted of sex-related offenses and murder. In 2019, however, Florida legislature passed, and the governor did sign this bill 7066, in which restricted the voting rights of people who had not paid court-ordered monetary sanctions and effectively re-disenfranchised them, the majority of those whose rights were restored by Amendment 4. So we do see this ebb and flow. In response to advocacy in 2018, legislation that provided many previously felony disenfranchised individuals their right to vote. We see later legislation signed by the governor in this same state in 2019, re-implementing economic restrictions that if they did not pay their fees, they were continued to have their right to vote restricted. Florida does remain the nation's remains the nation's leader in disenfranchised numbers overall. They have roughly 960,000 people currently banned from voting, often because they cannot afford to pay court-ordered monetary sanctions, and there's an estimated 730,000 Floridians who have completed their sentences but remain disenfranchised despite the ballot initiative in 2018. So we see that as a result of this, when we look at certain states like Arizona, Florida, Kentucky, South Dakota, and Tennessee, more than 1 in 10 African American adults are disenfranchised by these states. So we see, for one, disproportionate representation of certain demographics within felony disenfranchisement laws. And we do have to consider that when we look at the different degrees of felony disenfranchisement in the United States, there is a wide range of policy initiatives. This is a spatial issue that allows each state to have their own unique policy initiative regarding it. And what we'll do is look at some of these unique opportunities. It is also worth noting that this is not uniquely American. This has its roots in English common law, which a lot of our legal codes are inspired from, and it is referred to as civil death in the English common law. So, what is the legal legitimization of felony disenfranchisement in the United States? Well, we've really focused on this a lot in the past, and we're going to focus on it again. The 14th Amendment, predominantly Section 2, which allows states to abridge voting rights, quote, for participation in rebellion or other crimes. We've seen this revisited in recent years, but we also remember historically this was the constitutional legitimacy utilized to enable felony disenfranchisement. During the Reconstruction era and Civil Rights era, we saw certain criminal offenses that primarily black citizens were being incarcerated for were considered disenfranchising offenses. We see in numerous state constitutions, some for even moral turpitude, representing that there's a gray area in which interpretation is required to determine if a felony violation is disenfranchisable, which was predominantly utilized against minority collectives. And I believe, I may be getting this wrong, but I believe that state was Kentucky or Tennessee, one of the two. We also remember, and that was just off the top of my head, but I do know it is absolute. So we see some of these examples, including theft, vagrancy, even homelessness, and even under certain circumstances under Black Code legislation in the South, that it simply viewed as unemployment was viewed as a felony disenfranchising offense. So when we look at how our Supreme Court has provided our guidance, I apologize for that previous comment. It wasn't Kentucky or Tennessee, it was Alabama. I have it in the bottom of this slide. So when we look at our Supreme Court interpretations, we want to reflect on two predominantly. Richardson versus Ramirez, 1974, in which they implemented exclusion of felons from the right to vote has an affirmative sanction, legitimized by Amendment 14, Section 2, focusing on participation in rebellion or other crimes, heavily utilizing the or other crimes dimension of this amendment. Hunter versus Underwood, 1985, determined that felony disenfranchisement motivated by racial discrimination is unconstitutional, and they relied on that, as we mentioned previously, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We see that under the Alabama Constitution, that sentiment emphasizing the moral turpitude shall be qualified to vote. So we see that this expands the capacity of the states to be able to restrict voting rights to certain demographics, certain individuals under certain circumstances. I always like to say the state of Florida is a great example of felony disenfranchisement laws. And it's a good case study to question or to ask yourself the legitimacy and ethics behind felony disenfranchisement, as historically Florida allowed felony disenfranchisement for all felony convictions. That would be if you were convicted of any felony in that state, you were then restricted of your right to vote for the remainder of your life unless a governor provides a pardon. I merged those two words. And one of the unique, and this, I have not seen any circumstances when this was utilized to disenfranchise an individual, but we do see it is on paper as a felony violation, that in the state of Florida, you cannot tamper with another individual's lobster trap. And if you do and are proven guilty, this is a felony violation, which theoretically could legitimize the disenfranchising of an individual's right to vote for the remainder of their life. Now, when we look at disenfranchisement laws by states, it's important to know that for one, many states are revising their disenfranchisement laws with each decade, with each generation. And we have certain circumstances, like in Florida, where this is currently under review, and there are currently bipartisan efforts advocating for the dismantling of felony disenfranchisement, predominantly in the state of Florida. But we're going to look at this along four general lenses, four general ways of understanding the extent of felony disenfranchisement that can exist in the United States. So, first, the lowest level of felony disenfranchisement. There are 2 states and Washington, D.C. that allow you to vote from prison. There is no form of felony disenfranchisement, and they will provide you the opportunity to cast your ballot regardless of your certain circumstances. That exists in only 2 states and Washington, D.C. Important to remember. When we look at the majority of states, we see the majority of states, 23 states, allow voting after release from prison, but do restrict your capacity to vote while you are incarcerated. So we see that as the most frequent means of felony disenfranchisement, while other states do allow voting after prison, but there are further restrictions. In 15 states, we allow voting after prison, parole, and probation. So you have to complete your probationary period and parole period that oftentimes expands multiple years. And then you may cast your vote. So even if you are in the public, among the public, you still have certain voting restrictions in effect. We see that 10 states have some form, and this is where we have the most variation among states, some form of felony disenfranchisement that restricts voting access for certain felonies for the remainder of your life. So, Florida, if you are convicted of a felony violation in recent years for a sex violation, you will then be disenfranchised for the remainder of your life. And it's worth noting, prior to 2018, this was all felony convictions. After 2018, we had a concentration of these felony restrictions. So, where does Montana stand among this spectrum? Well, Montana is one of the majority. They allow voting after you've been released from prison. So you cannot vote while incarcerated, but you can vote immediately upon your release, even if you are going through parole or probation. We do know that states are frequently revising their felony disenfranchisement laws. That's why I am only asking you to remember the opposing ends of this spectrum. Remember that 2 states, Maine, Vermont, and DC, allow voting from prison, and that 10 states have some form of extreme felony disenfranchisement restricting one's vote for the remainder of their life. Here's a visualization of the extent of felony disenfranchisement laws in the United States in the year of 2015. It is hard to find a visualization in recent years as we have had continued developments all among these policy initiatives. But to give yourself a perspective of a place in time, in 2015, these were the current forms of felony disenfranchisement. We have some that have been some states in which they have restricted the extent of felony disenfranchisement while expanding them once again, like, for example, the state of Florida, which would still hold that status as an orange state that may lose voting rights permanently. Now, I want to also briefly acknowledge the role of a demagogue in democracy. We remember Federalist Paper 10, in which James Madison echoed the sentiments and fears of factions and our natural tendency to divide. But he also briefly mentioned our natural tendency to divide following the sentiments of demagogues, who will take the suffrage of the mass population and govern in their own self-interest. So what is a demagogue? Well, a demagogue is a political leader who seeks power by appealing to popular emotions, prejudices, or fears. They often do this rather than reasoned arguments and often claim exclusive representation of the people. I am the people's voice. I am the one you need to solve this problem. This is often done while undermining institutions, norms, minority rights once in power. Think about dismissing the capacities of certain institutions. We cannot trust our electoral institutions. We cannot trust our judicial branch or our civil systems. Instead, you must trust me, and I must be the one to bring us into a state of true prosperity. I must be the leader of true capacity, and that you cannot reach your fullest capacities unless you are governed by me. Those are the sentiments of the demagogue. Our founding fathers viewed demagoguery as the primary threat to Democrats globally. Men of factious tempers may be intrigued by corruption or by other means, first obtain the suffrage, and then betray the interests of the people, end quote. Oftentimes, the most populist sentiments are utilized in democratic states to govern in the most concentrated interests. James Madison echoed those sentiments as he drafted our Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper number 10, which is one of the primary means of understanding of political theory through the American perspective. So, we see those warning signs of demagoguery. We see the means in which a demagogue would utilize popular sentiments and populism to appeal to the emotions and prejudices and fears of certain collectives and certain sentiments in the general public to then govern based on their own self-interest. When we look at demagogues, demagoguery has been an issue plaguing democracy throughout decades. Oftentimes, many point to the rise of authoritarianism coming out of democratic states in the 1930s during World War II. And in that time, I think it's very beneficial to rewind because it takes us out of our current lens of partisanship, our current lens of restrictive understanding of politics, into a different time period in which we made a scientific means of understanding what it means to be a demagogue. If you are a demagogue, what are the requirements to this capacity? Sigmund Neumann wrote in 1938, measuring and studying the likes of authoritarian states in Italy and in Germany. He says, in order to be a demagogue, you must be a man of the people. You must have the man of the people persona, and every man is what you tend to convey yourself as. You must rise as an orator. By that I mean a well-spoken individual who can convey the public and mobilize masses. You are the one that can mobilize with just words. There is simplification and repetition of messaging. We're going to simplify this to the most accessible points and repeat and repeat and repeat to maintain this messaging as accessible to all, and there is more or less a mobilization of emotions, prejudices, and fears instead of a mobilization of complex thought and challenging. We see a self-promoter first. It is always, I am the one that can solve this before we need to build institutions. It is always, I can do this instead of this initiative will implement this impact. We see emphasizing spoken word over substantive policy formulation. It is the sentiments and emotion behind policy initiatives that we need to focus on instead of the nuanced advocacy and the downstream impacts that may occur. And we see the suppression or avoidance of counter perspectives or counter propaganda under certain circumstances. So they will call for the delegitimization of opposing viewpoints, opposing voices. They will diminish the validity of opposition. If there is criticism coming to the front desk of a demagogue, they will dismantle it as possible lies or misinterpreted focuses. So what is a demagogue? We see science and the scientific thinkers of the political sciences of the 1930s challenged by the threat of authoritarianism on the rise in states like Germany and Italy and Russia, and trying to summarize it through this analysis, continuing the discussion sparked by our founding fathers, and one that can be maintained until recent years. What do we learn? Read it, learn it, know it, read it, check it, do it. And what is due this week? And this is going to be very vague, so make sure you do your readings, contribute to the discussion, and check the modules tab for any assignments and quiz due dates that could be this week. I am focusing on maintaining this lecture as perfect as possible and getting those grades in as quick as possible. It is your responsibility to check your modules tab every single week to ensure that you are doing all the work expected of you. If you have any challenges to your ability to do that, communicate to me and I will do everything I can to help you. I would much rather help you do the work before it's due than tell you how you should have done it after it's been submitted. So please reach out if I can help. You know I will. Thank you guys. Have a good rest of your week.